Thank you for joining us on today's Renewed Minds. This edition is brought to you by Momco, a group of young women joining together to discuss challenges they face with building strong families based on Christian values. Momco meets at the Church on Main each Tuesday from 9:30 to 11:45. Contact the church office for more details. During the podcast, we'll be discussing challenges and opportunities that we all face no matter the season of life we're in. Each one of these episodes will offer some practical tips we've learned over the years and also share how love and grace can help each of us when we're trying to maintain hope. In the studio today, we have Tommy McDearis, pastor of the Church on Main in Blacksburg, Virginia, and Tonya Dinkel, owner and coach of Life in Action. Today's topic is going to be the faith factor. Why is it essential? We put our faith in a lot of people and also a lot of things like cars and money, but we aren't talking about that faith. We're talking about a different kind of faith.
Hello, everybody. We are glad that you are with us today. We have come here to have the next part of our podcast that we have just recently started called Renewed Minds. I'm Tommy McDearis, pastor of Church on Main in Blacksburg.
And I am Tonya Dinkel, the owner of Life in Action Coaching.
And we are doing some coaching today. Our intention is to talk a bit about the faith factor. Why is faith essential? And for some people, they hear the word faith and they just think of absolutely nothing but religion. And yet there is more to faith than that.
So much more. Yeah. Faith touches every part of our life. And we'll just dig in. I don't want to steal from the main content of the podcast, but we'll talk about all the areas where it touches. So why don't we start with just kind of defining faith?
Well, for me, I do come at faith from a religious point of view. I think of it as faith in Jesus Christ and what I base my life on there, but there's more to it than that. It does go deeper than that. For me, I always have a verse of Scripture that always jumps to mind. Is faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. To me, what that gives you is a place to base your faith and to remember that faith is that thing that's out there that you believe in that may not be something that you can see or that you can just put a finger on, but it is always there.
Yeah, and that makes it hard because we can't see it. As humans, right, we find comfort in things that we can see, things that we can touch, that we can make tangible, right? For me, I guess it's just a little more basic in that just having faith is just having complete trust in something. That might be a someone, it might be a something, whether that is an idea or a process. So from a religious perspective, we'll kind of get into where does faith play. So higher power, I think, as you've said, that's usually the first place that we go, right? It is commonly associated with either religious or spiritual connections.
And it's also, it goes deeper than that because you know, I have said to people, I said to a kid one time, he was talking about he didn't have any faith, and I said, every time you get in your car and you drive down the street, you're operating on faith. You have faith that car that you're meeting is going to stay on the other side of the road. I used to be a firefighter eons and eons ago. And every time we went to a fire scene, we had faith that the engineer on the truck was going to keep the water flowing, that the people that we were working with that was coming in behind us, that we were all going to be working as a team, and our safety depended on that team doing what they were supposed to do. We couldn't operate without faith in that team.
Yeah, that's actually really good. One example that touches two areas where faith plays. One of those being in other people's abilities, right? That you trusted, you had faith that your fellow firefighters were trained in a way that would not harm you, them, or anybody else on the scene, including the people you were trying to save, right?
Absolutely.
But it also showed faith in the process, that the training that was provided was the training that was needed for the situations that you were going to face, not just that the people learned what they needed to learn.
And sometimes I think people have a lack of faith because they don't have faith in the process. They haven't been trained properly.
Yep.
They haven't thought through what it means to have that faith in whatever the situation is that they're working in.
Yeah.
And so it's important to bring all of that together.
It is, because it impacts every single part of our life. Because when you don't have faith in any of those spaces that you're working in the moment, it impacts your view of the situation, which impacts your behavior through the situation.
Absolutely. I got some work being done at our house right now. It's, redoing a bathroom. The individual that's doing that work for us is somebody that I've known now 20 years. I know him to be a professional in what he does. I know that if he tells me he's going to do something, he's going to keep his word. I have faith in his abilities to do that and in his character. If I didn't, I wouldn't have invited him back in my house for 20 years now, and that faith has not been betrayed even once. It's important to focus on faith, but also to have something to base that faith on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about what faith is, and we're starting to get into why it's so important. So let's dig a little bit more into that idea. So in my experience, faith has helped me in really tough situations. And probably the space that I remember it most vividly starting, I was well into adulthood. So this is not one of those sweet little Tonya was 7 years old and Jesus spoke to her heart. Like, yes, it happened, but this is not the story for that. I distinctly remember when my mother passed away very suddenly. No indication that was going to happen. And the most amazing sense of peace through that experience. And my sister shares a very, very similar story. And we were talking in the moment of how odd it was that we were at such peace. But what we kept talking about was we have faith that there is a reason for this that, by the way, we're probably never going to know. Right? We're probably never going to understand exactly why. Now, here we are 15 years later, and I've started to see maybe why. Here and there, there's, bits of where that experience has helped me in different places. But that faith in knowing that even though I couldn't see or explain why this was happening, and I certainly didn't like it, because nobody likes that, right?
Absolutely.
I believed that there was a reason for it, and it helped me cope with that. Now, this is separate from the grieving, the cycle of grief, right? And it's separate from working through that, which is critically important, and that's actually a different episode that we're going to get into altogether. But just understanding that there's something, believing that there's something there, even if you can't see it, can help you. And you deal a lot in this space with people. A
whole lot in this space, because there are people all the time that are dealing with those kind of questions, or this has happened to me, or this has happened to my family, and I don't understand it, and how can I find peace? How can I find?
Right.
I have a story that's similar to yours, but it's also different to yours. My dad got very sick when I was in high school, and just stayed sick actually for the rest of his life, and it was really taking a toll on our family. It was taking a toll on a lot of things. And I remember one night. This will show you your pastor is very good at breaking into places.
Oh, great!
I went to our church, and I knew how to jimmy the back door. And
our pastor broke into a church.
I broke into a church.
Okay.
Yes. I broke into the church and let myself in and went to the sanctuary and sat down, and the cross that was in front of the church was lighted, and I flipped the lights on that cross and just sat there and prayed. And I remember that night very clearly. I remember how it looked and what it said, and I remember when I came out of that room thinking, I don't know how all this is going to turn out. But I'm okay. God's going to be with me. He's going to see our family through this, no matter where it ends up. Yeah. It's going to be all right. Yeah. That faith turned into an amazing peace for me that night, and it was a peace that I think of that story a lot. I think of that very night a lot. Yeah. That wasn't the only time, by the way, I broke into the church.
Well, that's just very comforting to know.
But it was always for a good cause. It was either go down there to sit in front of that light and pray, or when someone else was having a hard time, I would go let us both into the church, and we'd go down there and sit in front of that cross and pray. So I did a lot of ministry breaking into the church.
Sounds like. Okay. Well, all right. And Tommy can be reached at Church of Maine in Blacksburg, Virginia. All right. So another reason that faith is essential, and this might strike some of our listeners as a little unusual, because again, faith is so commonly tied to religion, but faith can help you with your sense of purpose and direction. And when I think about it in that vein, the professional HR/coach in me kicks in and says, yeah, this is in identifying what you were built to do and why you're here. So what strengths and skills were you gifted with when you were created to have the impact on this world that you were made to have? And when you get to a point where you have faith in your own skills and abilities, the impact that you can have is actually just tremendous. It's almost limitless, actually, because you're not afraid.
That's right.
To go do that, right?
You believe in you. One of the most important things that you're going to have happen in any individual's life is to learn to believe in yourself and to learn to discover what you're truly good at. Not let someone else define what you are, but look for the things that you're good at and try to lean into those things. When the shootings happened at Virginia Tech, I was one of the two primary chaplains of that event, so we had to end up telling all of those families and of their deaths and those kind of things. But what struck me in that was that everything I had done up to that point seemed to just train me more and more for that day. And I did lean into my strengths because I knew that I was good in that kind of a crisis. I had been in those different versions of those kind of crises before. And so I had leaned into my strengths all of my life in that. I just didn't realize how much it was going to prepare me for a very difficult day.
Yeah. And I'm assuming, because I've had similar experiences, and for me, when I find myself in those spaces, like I'm dealing with someone who suddenly lost a parent, right? I've been there. I've lived through that. I've walked that path. Then I'm at peace because I've made it through to a different side of where they are, not necessarily to the end, because I don't know that there's an end to that story, right?
It's not.
But I've made it to a different space in that story or in that path. You probably felt a similar type of peace because you knew that this was part of your purpose.
Oh, well, it was actually leaning very strongly into my purpose.
Yeah.
I knew that I had been called by Christ to make a difference in people's lives, and that was one of those moments when you will never have a better opportunity than to step into their lives and try to bring them hope in the middle of what seems like a hopeless situation.
Yeah.
Try to at least take the very first tiny step in being healed in that, is knowing that there's people there to hold you and to stand beside you and to not leave you alone. All of those things fell right into my wheelhouse of purpose.
Yeah. So I want to pause for a minute because I want to spend a little bit of time here because I think we have some different stories, you and I, on how and when we started to learn, or maybe this is more on my side, accept our purpose. You had a very clear vision relatively earlier in life. Can you share your story about kind of how and when you figured out what your purpose was going to be?
What I was going to do. Strangely enough, part of it started early on. Most people don't believe, but I started working when I was 14 years old at a funeral home, and I realized through that process that I had a gift, I guess you would call it, for ministering to people in the worst moments of their lives. Even as a kid, I seemed to be able to go into, and even to a degree, I have an interesting sense of humor, and I can help people to laugh, even in those difficult situations. But my calling came to me at a very different time in life. I was a senior in high school. We were dealing with several crises that were going on, and we were having a county-wide outreach event that was going on. The churches were sponsoring. And I was planning, I was going to college and majoring in history, and I wanted to be a history professor and have all of those things that I was going to be part of. And it suddenly, it was just as close as I'll never come to hearing a voice saying, "This is what I want you to do." And what was interesting about that was at that particular moment, I was unloading folding chairs off the back of a pickup truck. and so I was pretty sure God wanted me to unload folding chairs all of my life. I really didn't want to do that. I was getting a little nervous at that point in time, but it really was one of those moments when It was that moment when I realized I was not going to be satisfied unless I leaned into this purpose that I believe God had for my life. Mm-hmm. And leaning into that purpose made a huge difference for me. Mm-hmm. Well, it's changed everything for me, honestly.
It always does, right? So for me, I remember in my early 20s, I was actually just thinking about this on the way in to do this recording today. I have been in the space of human resources professionally for 25 years this month, which is crazy to think that I'm old enough to be doing anything for 25 years, but here we are. But I remember when that first started, and I'd been probably in the industry for 3 or 4 years, and my mom looking at me and saying, "Oh, you are doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Like, this was so made for you." And I'm like, okay, you're my mom. You're supposed to be supportive, all those things, right? But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work. It was challenging. It was fun. I was having some great career opportunities. But I didn't see the path of where it was going to go. It wasn't until much, much, much later that once events had started happening in my life and that pivotal moment when my mom passed, that I could start to look back, and I just started feeling a completely different sense of presence in the moment that I was in. And that's still there today. Like, my ability to just pause in the moment and take everything in and go, okay, there's a bigger reason for this, started then. But that's also when I started to reflect and go, oh, wait, I've done da-da-da-da-da, and that set me up for this. Oh, now I'm starting to see, right? So I could see where it was starting to unfold. But I don't recall actually hearing God's voice in some notable way, although I know he was speaking to me. I'm extremely hard-headed. I know, surprise, right?
Yeah, I'm shocked by that.
Shocked, yes. But it was about two years ago, between 2 and 2.5 years ago. And I was struggling with work mostly, and in a really, really bad space, mentally and emotionally. And all of a sudden, I started feeling this pull, and I couldn't explain it. And anytime I tried to slough it off and say, no, that's crazy idea, it just got stronger. It didn't quiet. And for me, it's been a very interesting, what I've come to believe is now my call and my mission, which is very different from where I thought I was going to be starting a career 25 years ago. But had I not started that career 25 years ago, I also wouldn't be able to be living this out either. So it's an amazing journey, I think, that we are placed on, you and I both believe, placed on that by Christ, right? And there's a bigger purpose in why we were here. I think people's stories are interesting, and it's always helpful, I think, when we can compare and contrast.
There's one thing that I said, and I want to make sure that this is clear to the people that's listening to us. I didn't hear an audible voice. It wasn't like, I've heard preachers get up in strange situations and say, God spoke to me. That's not what happened.
Yeah.
It was just that. You called it a pull. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the sense of what it was. It was a pulling. I suddenly realized there was something that I was doing there that not only was bringing me meaning, but I felt a call to go do it. Now, let me also say I was scared to death of that.
Absolutely.
I was not comfortable at all with that idea. I tried to not do it for a long
absolutely.
time. My pastor at the time was a very wise man. He invited me to speak one night at Sunday night church, and I told him, I'm not a preacher. I know you're not, but I want you to, I need you to preach here that night. I walked in to go speak, and the man's sitting on the front row. And I walked over and I said, I thought you were going to be out. He said, I never said I was going to be out. I said, I need you to speak tonight. Well, what he didn't know and no one else did was I was terrified of public speaking. Even giving a book report at school was just a nightmare for me. And I had always been so afraid of doing that. And I sat there with him, and I was scared to death, and I'd prepared, but I was still just terrified. When it came time to preach, I stood up and I walked up to the pulpit. When I got to the pulpit, I looked out, and I was not afraid at all, and I've never been since.
That's awesome.
Now, for me, that's one of those miracle stories that it wasn't like it was shifting the planet or anything, but it was certainly an affirmation to me of the calling that you're pursuing, the purpose. This is what you should be doing.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that it is not always easy. It is oftentimes scary. Same situation here. terrified of public speaking. In fact, in college, I avoided the public speaking class by taking a religion class, actually. I was like, well, okay, I can do that. I can handle a religion class. I was terrified to get up in front of people. And then fast forward a couple of years, my first job out of college required me to do what? Get up in front of a room that was all older men. I'm the only woman in the room at 22, 23, right? Giving a recap of numbers, also math, not my favorite thing. So like worst possible combination of things. Now is getting up in front of people my favorite thing to do? Maybe not my favorite. I do enjoy it if it's a topic I enjoy. I get a lot of energy out of it. But it still makes me very nervous sometimes, and I get jittery.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Well, but that's you're doing something that's worth doing, that you call it to purpose doing, when you still get a little nervous when you get up to do it. I never walk into the pulpit that I don't think what I'm about to do is important here.
Yeah.
And I always have this little, nagging little sense of, I wouldn't call it discomfort. It's not that, but it's that the jitters of knowing you're doing something important. Take it seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I've not been afraid to get up and do it.
Good.
I've been, there's a difference in those two.
I would agree. I would agree. So the other place where faith is essential is within our own mental health, and really, there's a lot of positive effects on faith and your mental well-being, especially when it comes to having hope, reducing anxiety, and we've talked a lot about having peace around things as well. So, I mean, there's been research around the link between faith and psychological health, and obviously, the higher your faith, then your psychological health is generally better. So,
let us point out, a lot of that research was done by secular institutions. It's not religious institutions that did that.
Yeah.
That's, in fact, I actually heard a scientist once or a social scientist who did a lot of this research said, I was hoping to disprove something that I proved profoundly.
Well, and that's probably, so it's interesting the wording there, because wanting to disprove an idea around faith is probably because of the religious connotation.
Absolutely it was.
Yeah.
He grew up in a religious household, but it was a healthy religion. And so... And he really wanted to disprove what he was looking at. What he did was he did the exact opposite. That's
an interesting thing that you bring up, too, that I think we all need to keep in mind is our perspectives on not just faith, anything, but we'll pick on faith since that's the topic for today, is going to be shaped by the environment in which we have been raised. So there's, tons of generational studies that say if you were born between this time and this time, this is how you behave, or, Gen X versus, millennials versus Gen Z, now we're into Gen Alpha, all those things. They are all generalizations that can be trumped by the environment that you grew up in.
Absolutely.
Every single time. And there are so many variables that come into that, mental health being a big one. Until recent years, mental health was a very taboo subject. You just didn't even talk about it. And in back, way back, it was you were hospitalized and not even thought about.
That's right.
Right? And really torture treatments given to those that had a mental or even behavioral health issue, right? So praise God that we are not in that space anymore, right? But there's still a lot of stigma around just the idea that there's something wrong mentally with someone. And I just think that's, first of all, it's a disservice to people who need support, right? And you and I both know that we joke about ourselves. We're a little off, right? It's probably why we get along with this, right?
I joke about you.
Of course you do. But, I mean, the reality is we all, every single human, because we're human, we are not divine, we all have things. We have flaws. We have challenges. We have fears and insecurities and doubts that we deal with every single day that feed things like anxiety and other mental and behavioral health challenges. So it's just really important to understand that this is a thing, and it's okay to talk about this thing.
It not only is okay, but it's important to talk about this thing.
Yeah.
I grew up in a house where my dad suffered profoundly from depression and worry. We would have joked sometimes, my mother and me, that my dad would, if he didn't have something to worry about, he would sit and invent something.
We said the same thing about my grandmother.
Yeah, it's just the reality. But you were talking about the environmental issues. It was years later when I discovered that his home environment had a lot to do with that. His mother was an abusive person. She had gotten pregnant by a man outside of her marriage in 1918. You didn't do that in 1918.
Wow, yeah.
And then my dad was the product of that. She never liked him because he was a source of embarrassment to her.
Oh, wow.
Well, we didn't know why Dad. Well, we knew that the war had a big influence on that because Dad landed at Normandy and went all the way to Germany and was wounded 4 times. He had a lot of PTSD that came off that. We didn't know the rest of the story, and the day that I discovered that he had been on a desperate search in his environment to get his mother to say "I love you," that's what he was looking for. His mental health was just gotten worse and worse when he could not do anything to affect that. Till he finally had a nervous breakdown in the early 60s, and it affected our family for years. And once I finally discovered that, it didn't change the environment, the things that I had seen and what had happened, but I suddenly realized, oh, this makes sense. His environment brought about all of that depression and that worry, and his wondering, why doesn't my mom love me? Why won't she do this? And I realize now that was, and it was amazing and how much influence that on him and on us.
Yeah. Yeah. That just makes my heart hurt for him.
Oh, it did. The first time he ever heard her say "I love you" was the week that he was going to the hospital to have his surgery, and he knew, and they knew as well, his sister and his mother, that he wasn't going to come back. He was in that poor health. And she told him as he was going out the door, said, "Son, I love you." Oh. And he was the most peaceful in that last week I ever saw him.
Wow. So that's a blessing. That is a blessing. All right, so let's talk about the faith factor in everyday life. So we've talked about some of the big stuff, like how we're wired and how we handle situations. What about just everyday challenges? The bad driver. Came across one of those today on my drive-in. Sometimes we just need a little extra help with everyday challenges. So, let's talk just a little bit about how faith helps us or can help us managing just the day-to-day.
Well, we hit on a little bit of that earlier when we talked about having faith in yourself. Sometimes you get in a situation in life where you just have to step back and look at it and say, I know that I can do this. I have faith that I'm going to be able to accomplish this. So I'm just going to have to step out and put on my, big boy pants and go get it done.
Right.
And see where we're going to go with that. I've been doing some personal counseling with a young lady who's going through some really tough times, and it's predominantly because of her environment as well. It's been tough with her. And I finally just looked at her recently, and I said, what makes you think you can't be what you know you're gifted to do? And I said, you're majoring in the wrong thing. You know you're majoring in the wrong thing in college. You've got a reason why you're doing it, but it's still the wrong thing, and you're miserable doing it, and you're not doing it well. Yeah. Why would you keep doing this? Yeah. I said, lean into what you believe that you can do, and you already know what that is. And I won't tell you exactly what she said in response to that, but it was a light bulb moment when she responded to that and said, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. Yeah. And she told me later on, she said, that one session made all the difference in the world for me. She went and dropped her major and started something else that day.
And life has been completely different.
It's been much better for her.
So I think I love those moments where you have a light bulb go off, like you said, and it is so freeing. And I don't know that I can adequately put words to the feeling. I've had that feeling, and I've had it. I think the first time I ever remember having it, actually, I took a strengths assessment, and in true Tonya fashion, swore the test was wrong because it didn't make sense of what came out. It was the Strengths Finder, so it gives you your top 5 signatures, right? And it said it was responsibility, relator, accountability, belief, and analytical. And I said, well, that's wrong because I'm not mathy. I'm not analytical. Like literally, I said it. The test is wrong. Now, can we just calibrate for a moment and say, this is done by Gallup. There probably is not a much more reliable test than those that Gallup does. But Tonya swore that the test was wrong. Well, then Tonya actually went back and read the book and read the explanation. And when it started talking about you like spreadsheets and you like data organized and you even like to color code things, oh my gosh, it was staring me right there in the face. Yes, absolutely. But the life-changing things that I've been able to experience as a result of being released from a perspective that I couldn't do something by a simple assessment that said I could, it's like it gave me permission to be who I was wired to be. I think the flip side of this whole piece is you talked just a few minutes ago about having faith that you can do it. There is a vulnerability that you have to have there that is scary.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Because what if we fail? And as humans, we are taught, I think, so it's an environmental thing, that failure is bad and success is good. And what I try to tell people in coaching sessions, because we do a lot of personal and professional development, and by the way, professional development is always based in personal development, always. But one of the things we talk about a lot is success is great, but failure is as well. Because failure leads to success. You know, it is so wonderful to know exactly what you want to do, what you want to major in, what you want your career to be, what you want your life to look like. But it is equally important, if not more so in some cases, to know what you don't want.
I said that to my daughter one time. She was struggling with something, and something she thought she wanted to do, and then suddenly it wasn't. And I said, so what have you learned from this?
Yeah.
And she's learned that, you know, whatever she was focusing on right then sucked. That was her first thing. And I said, okay, but beyond that, what have you learned about yourself? What can you turn this in to make it? I said, this isn't an end of a story. You're gonna tomorrow. You're gonna wake up to where are we gonna go with that?
Yeah. So the faith factor can also help us in building strong relationships. And this is, I think this actually goes back a little bit to what we talked about before, faith in ourselves and what we bring to relationships. We all have value. It looks different in all of us. We all bring something different. Again, we were created with different strengths and abilities and gifts and passions and talents and all the things. So that makes partnerships like this one, you know, here doing this podcast, something I never would have dreamed of, but really, really cool.
And both of us are leaning into our strengths
Absolutely.
in all of this as we're going along. And chances are pretty good at some point we're going to do a topic here we're going to fail at.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
You know, or at least you are. But
gee, thanks. You have faith in that, do you?
Oh, I have failed more times than I can imagine at things in the course of my existence. And the question is, are you going to get back up and go at it? And that's one thing. I just heard someone recently talking about how they were never going to get married again because they'd had a failed marriage and they were afraid to commit and afraid, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yes, okay, but what did you learn from that failure? You don't have to always fail at relationships just because you had a failed relationship.
Right.
You know, what can you take forward to that?
Yeah.
I failed miserably at a church in Atlanta. I had 2 big successes and just felt so good about myself and went to this church that never felt quite right anyway, and then got into it and realized all of the work that I'm ever going to do here is not going to turn a dysfunctional situation around. I'm going to have to step out of this and let somebody else try to do this. But that was, you know, a miserable feeling for me at that time. Yet I came away learning some very important things, one of which was I needed to go to counseling about some things. And that took me to, I was planning to go to 3 or 4 sessions of counseling, and about 2 years later, I finally wrapped it up.
Yeah.
It really was tremendous help to me I had faith in someone else's gifts.
Yeah.
And suddenly faith in those gifts was paying off for me.
Isn't it funny, too, how God works and reveals things to us that we wouldn't necessarily get to on our own? Like it sounds like he revealed it to you through a challenging work situation, because for you,
Absolutely.
church is work. And by doing that, he placed you in a space that gave you greater growth that probably, I'm assuming, wasn't even tied to the challenges at the church.
Yeah, I would give just a slightly different twist to what you just said. God did everything but come to me in a burning bush to keep me from going to that church.
Okay.
I kept having these signals, that that's not the right place, and I was just arrogant enough in thinking of myself. I had a lot of faith in myself at that point.
Well, I was thinking earlier he humbled you.
It was just a misplaced faith on that one. It really was, and I got myself into that, and I kept. It was one of those places where you were praying, God, just open the door and let me go somewhere else, and I'll be. And it just didn't come about. And finally, one day, I said, I've just got to walk away from this.
Yeah,
it's time. They're unhappy. I'm unhappy. Nobody's happy. We've got to. And when I stepped out of that situation, that's when doors started opening.
It's amazing how that happens.
It over and over, and it led me not only to another church that I worked in as an interim that really rebirthed my confidence, but then ended up bringing me to Blacksburg, where I've spent 27 of the best years of my life. So
and talking about relationships, you talked about marriage specifically, and just to be clear, this can be any type of relationships. Faith can help us build any type of relationship, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship that's not a marriage. And heaven knows I've had my fair share of those over the years. I married later in life, and have the most amazing husband I could have ever dreamed. And I know now, and knew as soon as we had been dating a little bit, and I got over my fear. I'm like, oh, this is who God planned for me. This is the one that I was supposed to find. But walking that path was really hard. And my sister kept telling me, and now she will hear, if she listens to this podcast, she's going to actually hear me say it, because I've never said this to her, because I didn't want to hear the I told you so. But she kept telling me, you have not learned something that God wants you to learn. So he continues to expose you to situations until you learn what he wants you to learn. And she was right. Yes, I said it. My sister was right. But what I ended up having to do was I hit what I would say was rock bottom emotionally. And I had to make a decision, and I will never forget sitting in this space in my house going, okay, I've got three choices. I can either let this destroy me, and I can just stay in this space. I can go back to how I've always been, what I've always known, and continue to do what I've always done, or I can change, and I can be a better person than I've been before, and I can be a healthier person. And I chose the last one because been there, done that on the second one, and I hated where I was in that moment. I didn't like the person I was. I didn't like who I saw in the mirror, and I didn't like how I felt. And oh my gosh, what an amazing change. And when I made that choice and I started making some life choices that were different, healthier choices physically, running, enrolling in my first half marathon, never would have thought in a million years that I would have done that. By the way, if anybody listening wants to do a half marathon, word of advice, don't sign up for a desert-based marathon in September. Not one of my smartest moves, but I did it. I completed it. And that was a reset trip for me, where I came back and said, okay, what do I want my life to be going forward? And all these things that I've changed in the last several months, how do I want that to be me going forward? And that opened the door to come back and go, okay, now I'm ready. I'm ready for what God has prepared for me. And in this case, it was a relationship, which has turned out to be absolutely fabulous. So, sometimes it's being vulnerable to relinquish control of something and step into a space that's kind of scary.
Well, anytime you have faith, though, It's going to affect any kind of relationship that you're in. I've just told about the relationship I have with this church that I've been in for 27 years, and I've had faith in them. They've had faith in me, and we've all had faith in God, and we've tried to move forward with all of that. But I also have, I would defy anybody to come up with a better marriage than I was been blessed with. I knew by my third date that this was a woman that I could spend my life with. Now, she was not quite as convinced at that moment. Faith took a little longer for Susan than it did for me. But
Susan
it was still turned out well.
Wonderful person. Wonderful person, yes. Yeah. So faith also can help us make good ethical choices and be kind of our moral compass, our true north, some people might say, and just help us have a more positive outlook on life.
Well, I think, if I didn't believe that, I would never have been in the business that I'm in right now. One of my favorite lines that sometimes people understand, sometimes they don't, is, what would Jesus do? Yeah. I've kind of built my life around, okay, this guy was one of those people who would walk into a situation where nobody wanted him, and he was clearly the enemy, and he knew what it was going to cost him, and he still stepped out and did the right thing. And you cannot point to a situation that it wasn't the right thing. Yeah. I think faith can point us in that direction, and even people who are not people of religious people, they've still been brought up with some kind of a moral code. The right way that you treat people. How do you do things? Right. And having faith in that moral code, and that it will take you somewhere that's important to go. That still will take you somewhere that's important to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about how we can cultivate and strengthen our faith, because we've talked about why it's important, and we've even talked about how it's hard and it's just scary sometimes. So how do you work through those things? So one of the things, and we've talked about this a lot, is just our daily practice of what we do. For me, I love my Bible studies. I love when I can get some quiet time. Mine's in the morning. Well, sometimes I do it at night. It just kind of depends on the day. But just time where I can get away. I can have my Bible. I can generally have some sort of Bible study that I've felt called to do. And I can get some quiet time with God and prayer, and even journaling too. I found a lot of power in journaling.
This probably will not come as a giant shock to you, but my quiet time comes whenever it hits me.
That doesn't surprise me.
And then I move, but I do it every day, and I write a daily devotional.
You do.
The reason that I did that, and I've told people this, is I did that for years and never published it, put it out there anywhere. Someone happened to see one day. They were having a problem. I gave them my devotional. They said, you need to put this on social media or something.
And you're like, that's a good idea.
And I never thought about doing that. And so I've done it ever since and put them out. Well, that's one of those things that I sit in my quiet time, find the scripture that's meaning something to me. I concentrate on it. And then I start building out this devotional that I was writing originally for myself to learn things from. And then now I send it out to other people, but it's that focused moment where you just sit, and you allow your faith to grow in that moment, to think about whatever the situation happens to be that you're dealing with at the time, and whatever it is that, in my case, what I believe God is saying to me, but what you need to try to build on in that.
I didn't realize that your devotions, which I am on that list, and I love seeing those. I didn't realize it started as a journaling activity. Yeah,
that's what it was.
That's interesting.
I don't know that I would have called it a journaling activity just because for some reason the word journal bothers.
It feels girly, doesn't
it? I wasn't going to say that, but there's that thing I used to see girls do. I'm keeping a diary. Come on, But yes, it was a journaling activity to me. That's how that began, because I am remarkably ADD, and if I don't make myself sit and study and think, I wrote to stay focused, and to me it was just a good thing to do, and it helped me to grow and to become better, and then realized these things I'm writing, this one just helped somebody. Maybe this next one will, and so I just started sending them out, and have been surprised at how at how many people read these things, not just in our church or in our town, but in other places.
Yeah, I think it's important to just point out that the purpose of this is when it helps other people, that's fantastic. But I don't want people to underestimate the value of how it can help the person.
Well,
right?
I will say this about, even my preaching. If it hasn't spoken to me before I get up at church, it's not going to speak to anybody else.
Yeah.
That's what my devotionals are, is it speaks to me. I learn, there's something that comes to me in that.
Yep.
And then my hope is just to put that out there where it'll help somebody else. But it starts with my relationship with God and where I'm hoping to go with that.
Yep. Something else we can do is we can seek inspiration. And this can come from lots of places. I mean, my goodness, I actually find spiritual inspiration sometimes on social media, of all places.
Oh, yeah.
Whether the memes are meant to be that way or not, sometimes they just hit me based on the space that I'm in. But uplifting podcasts, which hopefully this is for people. And I know I'm a huge podcast listener and have several in my library that I specifically go to when I'm needing something like that. And worship music, that's one of my favorites, is just letting that music pour over me. And sometimes I just sit there, not because I need something in particular, but that's just what makes me happy and puts me in a good space.
I had a strange experience the other day. I just happened to come across this song that I was looking for something else. Happened to come across this song, and I was sitting there, and I found myself all teary about it. And I walked down the hall, and I asked our minister of music, Tim Woolwine, I said, "Have you ever heard of this song?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, find it, because that's the close to my funeral." I said, "Whenever that comes, that's it, and you've got to hang on to it." So he said, "Well, I might ought to go listen to that." And I said, "Well, you just keep that." And you start thinking now, who's going to do the solo parts? Who's going to? I said, because that's the close to my funeral.
Wow.
That's what's going to happen. I said, now, I hope that I am just so old that you can't, and that you are on a walker before we have to do that. But
Amen.
That's the close to my funeral right there. So.
Yeah.
And it was inspirational. I mean, that sounds weird, but it was one of those moments when you suddenly come across something and you think, I hope that can be said of me.
Yeah. It's your legacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something else that we can do to seek inspiration is by finding other people who are, in our case, we focus, not solely, certainly we talk to people from all walks of life, but people who are strong in faith can help us ground in the faith. But finding people who are part of our community, community of faith, community of interest, community of gifts. You can put any number of words into that scenario.
I've got a good friend who lives in Roanoke who's not a person of faith. He would not claim. But every time I'm with him, I come away inspired. He's always has something that he's investing in, something that he's doing, something that he's gotten worried about. And instead of just worrying about it, he's out there trying to do something about it and getting involved in it.
That's awesome.
He's always an individual that, they're just, if you look for it, you can find inspiration.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And you may find it, strangely enough, on social media. Yeah. You may find it in music. You may find it in friends. You pick your friends well. You start with that. And, too many people, I think, I'm dealing with somebody else right now who's in a real mess in their lives because they managed to pick the wrong friend, and it's not paid off for them at all.
Yeah.
But if you pick the right people that you're going to be with, and you pick the right situations you're going to be in, you will find inspiration in that.
Yeah, and when
as long as you're looking for it.
That's true, and open to
and
it
open
as
to
well,
what
right?
Going to be there.
Open to growth, and when we talk about right people, because I completely agree with you. When we talk about right people, what we're talking about is people who feed you, not drain you. Right.
Absolutely.
So we do one or the other in every single interaction, and we need people who do both, right? So sometimes I'm the person that feeds others, or I fill other people's bucket. There's a book out called How Full Is Your Bucket, and it's all about this. How are you getting replenished? That particular book is more focused on work stuff, but it really applies to any part of your life. Are you spending time with people who drain you, or who lift you up in some way? And when I say lift you up, it's bring you along and feed this not need for glory or any of those things, but help you grow as a person.
I'll give you one more in this that I think about, but I've never thought about it in these words until you just said that. Whose bucket are we filling? Is it if someone needs inspiration, if that, is our life something that's going to fill their bucket, or is it going to drain their bucket?
Well, and are we intentional in even thinking about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say, honestly, until you said that just now, I'm probably not as intentional as I should be.
Yeah,
in every situation.
There have times when we're just not, but but as people of faith, whatever you stop and you look at it and you say, okay, am I being a person that would fill someone else's bucket with hope, with whatever it is that they're needing at the time, anything positive, Could they look to me and find some inspiration for some contents for that bucket that they feel is almost empty?
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a lot.
It was a lot.
That was a lot. So let's do a quick recap for our listeners. So some key things. First of all, faith is not religious. It's not just religious. It can be experienced in every single part of our life.
Yeah.
And it can help us navigate the challenges that we have in our life. And it's also hard. It can be hard for us to give up control. That makes us vulnerable, and that is extremely uncomfortable.
And do not think that just because you are a person of faith, you're never going to have a doubt. Mm-hmm. That doubt is going to be there. You're always going to have those things that are going to make you stop and look. But I'm trying to remember that I ought to know the name, but I'm missing it. But who said there's more faith in honest doubt than all the creeds ever written? We need to hang on to that fact that doubt can be a gift because it keeps you reaching. It keeps you exploring. It keeps you trying to find the answers, so forth. So if you're having big doubts somewhere along the line, hang on to them until you find something better to stick in that slot. Yeah. And you will if you keep looking for it. Yeah.
And the keep looking falls into your routine too, right?
That's
Finding that routine that can help you build the foundation so that that you can fill those spaces like you were talking about, and share your story and your path with those that are around you. Your network of people can walk with you through finding the routine that works for you, and knowing too that routine can change over time as new opportunities are presented to you. You might change what your routine looks like, but my guess is that you'll find that there's some sort of commonality of what you tend to lean to that helps to replenish some of your bucket. At the end of the day, reflecting on where faith plays a role in our lives is really important so that we can actively nurture where that's going. All right. Good chat.
We had brought a lot out of this.
Yes, we did. We did. All right.
We're glad that you are here with us today, and we hope that you'll come back and be with us again the next time that we meet for this podcast.
Absolutely. So if you would like to engage in conversation with us, we actually do have an email address, and that is renewedminds@church. And if you would like to get Tommy's daily devotional that he mentioned, just send us an email to that same email address, and we'll get you on the distribution list for that. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to see you next week.
Goodbye.
Hopefully this brings a renewed perspective to the challenges and opportunities you're facing today. What steps are you going to be taking to show love and grace to everyone? If you have any questions or comments about our podcast, please send an email to renewedminds@churchonmain.church. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. Listen next week for the next Renewed Minds.